This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the cul-de-sac of Maplewood Lane in hues of orange and gold. The neighborhood was picturesque, the kind of place that graced real estate magazines with headlines like Suburban Bliss or The Safest Streets in America. Every house stood like a carbon copy of the next, two-story structures with white picket fences, freshly painted shutters, and flower beds blooming in perfect symmetry. Lawns were trimmed to precision, not a blade of grass out of place, and the asphalt of the cul-de-sac gleamed dark and smooth, as if freshly paved. A gentle breeze carried the faint scent of freshly baked cookies from a nearby kitchen, mixing with the distant laughter of children playing in someone's backyard. It was, on the surface, the kind of neighborhood where nothing bad could ever happen. But Maplewood Lane had its secrets, buried beneath the manicured perfection like rot beneath the floorboards. And Veronica Hayes was the only one who knew just how deep the rot ran. It had been years since Veronica last walked the streets of Maplewood Lane. Returning to her childhood home felt like slipping into a nightmare she had thought she'd escaped. The house, a modest two-story tucked near the end of the cul-de-sac, loomed in the evening light. Its shutters were faded, the paint peeling from years of neglect. The once vibrant rose bushes her mother had tended so carefully were now overgrown, their thorny branches twisting and knotting like veins beneath pale skin. It was the only house on the street that looked out of place, an ugly scar on an otherwise pristine landscape. And yet, it was hers now. The inheritance papers had been clear. Eloise Hayes had left everything to her daughter, the house included, a parting gift from a woman who had lived and died within those walls. The neighbors had noticed Veronica's return immediately. It was impossible not to. On Maplewood Lane, everyone noticed everything. Within hours of her arrival, curtains shifted in the windows of the surrounding houses, shadows moving as eyes peered out to get a glimpse of her. A few braver souls had approached, offering fake smiles and shallow pleasantries. "Welcome back," they said, though Veronica could see the questions lurking behind their cheerful tones. Why had she come back? Why now? The woman who had inherited the Hayes house was an enigma to them, a ghost of the awkward girl they remembered but barely noticed in her youth. Veronica had kept her responses polite but brief, her tone cool and disinterested. The less they knew about her, the better. Inside the house, everything felt heavier. The air was thick, carrying the faint smell of dust and mildew. The furniture sat exactly as her mother had left it, covered in white sheets that gave the room the look of an abandoned morgue. Veronica walked slowly through the house, her fingers trailing along the walls, brushing against the peeling wallpaper. Memories flooded her mind with every step, her mother's voice echoing from the kitchen, the clink of teacups on the coffee table, the slam of doors during her mother's more erratic episodes. The weight of the past pressed down on her chest like a stone, and she could almost feel her mother's presence still lingering, watching her from the corners of the dimly lit rooms. Maplewood Lane had always been her mother's obsession. Eloise Hayes had spent years trying to fit into the neighborhood, baking pies for the potlucks, volunteering at the school's PTA, hosting afternoon teas. But no matter how hard she tried, she was never truly accepted. The neighbors whispered about her when they thought she couldn't hear, mocking her quirks and eccentricities. Eloise had grown increasingly paranoid over the years, convinced that the neighbors were conspiring against her. She said they sabotaged her garden, tampered with her mail, left cruel anonymous notes in her mailbox. Veronica had never seen the notes herself, but her mother insisted they were real, clutching them in her trembling hands as evidence of the neighborhood's cruelty. And then, one rainy afternoon, Eloise had locked herself in the bathroom and never come out. Veronica had been the one to find her. Her mother's body slumped against the cold tile, the smell of spilled pills thick in the air. The neighbors hadn't come to the funeral. They had sent flowers instead, their cards filled with hollow condolences and rehearsed sympathy. Veronica had left Maplewood Lane soon after, vowing never to return. But now, standing in the shadow of her childhood home, she felt the anger she had buried for years clawing its way to the surface. The neighbors hadn't changed much. The faces were older, more lined, but the personalities were the same. Mrs. Abernathy, the self-righteous gossip who spent her mornings pruning her garden and her afternoons drinking wine on the porch, was still there. Mr. and Mrs. Rowland, the elderly couple who walked their golden retriever every evening at 6 p.m. sharp, were as predictable as ever. The Talbots, a young couple who had moved in shortly before Veronica left, now had 2 children who rode their bikes in lazy loops around the cul-de-sac. The faces blurred together, each one a reminder of the collective cruelty that had driven her mother to madness. They smiled at her now, offered her casseroles and cookies, but Veronica could see through their charade. At night, Maplewood Lane transformed. The tidy houses and perfect lawns were cloaked in shadows, the quiet almost deafening. Veronica would sit by her window, watching the neighborhood through the thin lace curtains. She saw the way the lights flickered on and off in the houses, the way the silhouettes of her neighbors moved behind drawn curtains. The Rowland dog barked at precisely 9:30 every night, a quick, sharp yelp before falling silent. The Talbot kids played video games in their upstairs bedroom, the glow of the screen illuminating their window. Mrs. Abernathy stayed up late on her porch, sipping from a wine glass and scrolling through her phone, her face lit by the pale blue light of the screen. Veronica became a shadow, slipping through the cul-de-sac unnoticed. She walked the streets late at night, her bare feet silent on the cool pavement. She stood in the darkness beneath streetlights, invisible to the eyes of her neighbors. She felt the darkness wrap around her like a cloak, comforting and familiar. It whispered to her, reminded her of the years of pain, the injustice her mother had suffered. It told her what she already knew, that the people of Maplewood Lane didn't deserve their perfect lives, their perfect homes. They had taken her mother from her, stolen the only family she had, and now it was her turn to take something from them. The first step of her plan was simple: wait. She let herself sink into the rhythm of the neighborhood, becoming part of the background. She smiled when necessary, waved when waved to, accepted invitations she had no intention of honoring. She played the part of the quiet, grieving daughter, just another unremarkable resident of Maplewood Lane. She had returned to the cul-de-sac with a purpose, and she wouldn't leave until every single one of her neighbors had paid for what they had done. Veronica Hayes was no longer the awkward girl they had ignored. She was something else now, something darker. And Maplewood Lane, for all its perfect houses and perfect lives, had no idea what was coming. Veronica Hayes' childhood had been an exercise in survival. Maplewood Lane, with its pristine lawns and smiling neighbors, had been her battleground. Her earliest memories of the cul-de-sac were drenched in tension, the kind of unease that clings to you even in moments of silence. She had learned young that perfection was an illusion, that behind every warm greeting and friendly wave, there was venom. And no one had tasted more of that venom than her mother, Eloise Hayes. Eloise had been an anomaly on Maplewood Lane. While other mothers gossiped on their porches and traded casserole recipes, Eloise kept to herself. She wasn't like the others, and the neighbors punished her for it in subtle, relentless ways. Veronica remembered how her mother always seemed out of sync with the rhythm of the cul-de-sac, how her refusal to conform made her a target. And Eloise was eccentric, yes. She loved gardening late at night under the light of the moon and often spoke in odd metaphors that no one else seemed to understand. But to Veronica, she was simply her mother, flawed but loving, a woman who tried her best to shield her daughter from the icy stares and whispered mockery that surrounded them. The neighbors didn't see her that way. To them, Eloise was the crazy woman at the end of the street. They talked about her behind closed doors, their words dripping with derision. But their disdain seeped into the open in ways they thought she wouldn't notice. It was in the way they avoided her at block parties, the way their smiles turned tight and brittle when she approached. It was in the way Mrs. Abernathy, who lived directly across the street, would accidentally water her lawn just as Eloise stepped outside, soaking her shoes and forcing her back indoors. It was in the notes that began appearing in their mailbox, unsigned and cruel. "Keep your freak show inside. We don't need your kind here." Veronica was only 10 when the first note arrived. She found her mother standing in the kitchen, the slip of paper trembling in her hands. her face pale and drawn. Eloise didn't say anything, but the hurt in her eyes was unmistakable. Veronica had tried to cheer her up, pulling out crayons and drawing a picture of their house with a big yellow sun overhead. Her mother had smiled weakly, but the moment had already passed, the darkness settling in. The notes kept coming. They were always short, vicious sentences scrawled on torn pieces of paper. The words were different, but the message was always the same. You don't belong. At first, Eloise had tried to brush them off, laughing bitterly as she tossed them in the trash. Cowards, she muttered once, her voice shaking. But as the weeks turned into months, the laughter stopped. The notes piled up in the trash can, then in a shoebox that Eloise hid in her closet, as if she couldn't bear to throw them all away. Veronica wasn't spared from the neighbors' cruelty either. At school, the other children mirrored their parents' disdain, taunting her with nicknames like Cuckoo's Kid and whispering behind her back. She tried to ignore it, but the words clung to her like tar, sinking into her skin and staining her thoughts. She dreaded recess, when the other kids would form tight little groups that excluded her, their laughter like needles against her ears. Even the teachers seemed distant, their smiles strained and their patience thin whenever Veronica's hand went up in class. She became quieter, retreating into herself, a habit that would follow her into adulthood. Eloise's paranoia grew worse with time. She became convinced that the neighbors weren't just sending notes, but actively sabotaging her life. She said they were breaking into the house while she was away, rearranging furniture and stealing small, insignificant items just to unnerve her. She swore the Robinsons' teenage son had poured bleach into her rose bushes, killing them overnight, and when Eloise's car tires were slashed one morning, she was certain she knew who had done it. Though of course, she had no proof. To Veronica, it all seemed plausible. She had seen the way the neighbors looked at her mother, heard the whispered insults. She believed Eloise because she had no reason not to, but as the years went on, Eloise's behavior became more erratic. She started keeping the curtains drawn at all hours, convinced that someone was watching the house. She installed multiple locks on the doors, checking them obsessively, sometimes 3 or 4 times in a single hour. She stopped leaving the house altogether, retreating into a world of whispered conspiracies and frantic journaling. Veronica would often find her at the kitchen table, scribbling furiously in a notebook, her eyes wild and unfocused. The breaking point came when Veronica was 17. By then, the house had become a tomb, dark and silent, filled with the oppressive weight of Eloise's unraveling mind. Veronica came home from school one afternoon to find her mother sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by torn-up scraps of paper. At first, Veronica thought they were the notes from the neighbors, but as she got closer, she realized they were pages from Eloise's journals. Her mother was crying, the sound low and guttural, like an animal in pain. She looked up at Veronica with red-rimmed eyes and said, "I can't take it anymore." Those words echoed in Veronica's mind for weeks, long after she found her mother's lifeless body in the bathroom. The neighbors, of course, were polite about it. They left flowers on the porch and casseroles in the fridge. Mrs. Abernathy even stopped by to say how sorry she was, though Veronica could see the guilt in her eyes, the way she couldn't quite meet her gaze. No one mentioned the notes or the slashed tires or the whispers. They pretended Eloise's death was a tragedy no one could have foreseen, a sad but inevitable ending for a woman who had always been a little off. Veronica hated them for it. She hated their hypocrisy, their cowardice, their refusal to admit what they had done. And she hated herself for not being able to stop it. After the funeral, Veronica packed a single suitcase and left Maplewood Lane. She didn't look back. She spent the next 8 years drifting from place to place, working dead-end jobs, trying to bury the memories of her mother and the neighborhood that had destroyed her. But no matter how far she went, she couldn't escape the bitterness that festered inside her, the slow-burning rage that refused to die. Maplewood Lane had taken everything from her. Her childhood, her innocence, her mother. It had hollowed her out and left her with nothing but anger. When the letter arrived, informing her that she had inherited the house after her mother's passing, Veronica almost threw it away. But something stopped her. She thought about the house, the neighbors, the street she had grown up on. She thought about Eloise, broken and crying on the living room floor, and for the first time in years, she felt something close to purpose. She would go back, she would face them, and she would make them pay. Veronica Hayes had always been a meticulous person. As a child, her notebooks were filled with neat rows of handwriting, every letter carefully formed, every page perfectly aligned. She had been obsessed with order, with structure, as though she could impose control over her chaotic world by keeping her belongings tidy and her thoughts organized. But the plans she was creating now were something else entirely. A web of deception so intricate, so methodically constructed, that it felt almost alive. Every piece was connected, every move accounted for. The notebook she used now wasn't for harmless notes or school assignments. It was a manifesto, a blueprint for revenge. Each night, after the streetlights outside Maplewood Lane flickered on and the houses settled into silence, Veronica sat at the small desk in her bedroom, illuminated only by the dim glow of a desk lamp. The air in the room was heavy, the faint scent of mildew from the old house clinging to the walls. Spread out before her were pages of sketches, notes, and charts. There were crude maps of the neighborhood, drawn in sharp, angular lines. Each house was marked with a name, its residents listed along with their routines, vulnerabilities, and weaknesses. There were schedules annotated in red ink. What time the Rowlands walked their dog, when Mrs. Abernathy took her daily nap, when the Talbot children were usually left unsupervised. Veronica's pen moved quickly, each stroke deliberate, her breathing shallow and steady as her mind churned through the possibilities. She had studied her neighbors with a predator's focus. Every conversation, every interaction, no matter how brief, had been an opportunity to gather information. She asked seemingly harmless questions, her tone friendly, her smile warm, but every answer was another piece of the puzzle. Mrs. Abernathy, for example, had mentioned offhandedly during one of their brief chats that she often forgot to lock her back door at night. A simple detail, easily overlooked, but to Veronica, it was everything. She had filed it away, storing it for later use like a spider weaving a thread into its web. Veronica's notebook contained more than just observations. It held her ideas, her experiments, her failures and successes. She had spent weeks researching poisons, studying their effects and how to administer them without detection. Online forums, hidden in the dark corners of the internet, provided her with the knowledge she needed. She learned about the properties of ricin, cyanide, and arsenic, taking careful notes on how to extract or acquire them. The internet was a terrifyingly vast resource, and Veronica used it with ruthless efficiency. She knew she couldn't leave a trail, so she used disposable phones, fake accounts, and VPNs to cover her tracks. Her searches left no trace, her activities invisible to anyone who might come looking. But knowledge wasn't enough. Veronica needed to practice. To ensure that her methods were flawless, she began by testing on the animals that wandered too close to her yard. The stray cat that used to perch on her front porch was the first. She left a bowl of milk laced with poison just outside the door, then watched from the window as the animal drank greedily. Its death was quick, almost peaceful, the faint shudder of its body the only sign that something was wrong. Veronica felt no guilt as she buried the body in the backyard later that night. It wasn't personal, it was necessary. Each experiment brought her closer to perfection, her confidence growing with every success. Her first target required something simple, something subtle. She didn't want to attract attention, not yet. The Rowlands, with their predictable routines and quiet lives, were the perfect choice. Veronica had noticed the flickering light bulb on their porch, the way Mr. Rowland had grumbled about fixing it, but never seemed to get around to it. She knew that if she tampered with the wiring, no one would think twice about it. It took her 3 nights to execute the plan. On the first, she scouted the area, noting the position of their security cameras and the angle of the streetlights. On the second, she waited until the dog's barking had subsided, then crept into their yard under cover of darkness. Her movements were precise, her breathing steady as she unscrewed the bulb and carefully exposed the wires. On the third night, she returned to finish the job, connecting the wires to a small, homemade device she had crafted from instructions she'd found online. When Mr. Rowland finally got around to changing the bulb, the resulting shock would be fatal, and no one would question it. Veronica's methods grew bolder with each success. For Mrs. Abernathy, she chose poison, slipping it into the woman's wine supply while she was distracted by a delivery driver. She watched from her window as the old woman took her final drink, her body crumpling on the porch in a lifeless heap. For the Talbots, she opted for fire, using gasoline and a carefully placed rag to ignite their backyard shed. The flames spread quickly, consuming the wooden structure and everything around it. The family escaped, coughing and terrified, but the fire left their homes scarred and uninhabitable. It wasn't a direct kill, but it sent a message. No one was safe. As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere on Maplewood Lane began to shift. The neighbors, once friendly and open, became paranoid and mistrustful. They locked their doors and windows, installed security systems, and avoided eye contact when passing each other on the street. Veronica watched the fear spread like a disease, infecting every corner of the cul-de-sac. It was exhilarating. She thrived on the chaos, the way it made her neighbors second-guess themselves and each other. They didn't suspect her, the quiet, polite woman who lived at the end of the street. She was invisible to them, a shadow hiding in plain sight. But Veronica knew she couldn't afford to get complacent. Every plan, no matter how careful, carried a risk. She double-checked her work, triple-checked it, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. She studied crime scene investigations, learning how detectives piece together evidence and what mistakes criminals often made. She wore gloves at all times, disposed of her tools in separate locations, and burned anything that might link her to the crimes. Her notebook, the most damning piece of evidence, was hidden in a hollow space beneath the floorboards in her bedroom. She checked it every night, running her fingers over the pages as though reassuring herself that it was still there. The web she was weaving grew tighter with each kill, each thread pulling the neighborhood closer to collapse. Veronica felt like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, every note building toward a crescendo that only she could hear. Her revenge was unfolding exactly as she had planned, the ghosts of her past finally being laid to rest. But in the back of her mind, a single thought lingered, a faint whisper she couldn't quite silence. Perfection didn't exist. Every plan had a flaw, every web a loose thread, and all it would take was one mistake to bring everything crashing down. The killing spree began on a night that seemed no different from any other, its ordinariness acting as the perfect cover. Maplewood Lane was quiet, the cul-de-sac bathed in the soft artificial glow of streetlights. The houses stood still and silent, their facades masking the simmering paranoia that had begun to take hold of the neighborhood. For weeks, accidents and tragedies had rippled through the once idyllic community like cracks in porcelain. There was no good reason to remove the threat from the parking lot and hide the parlor and the basement rooms with its formal living room. But tonight, those cracks would widen, and the darkness Veronica Hayes had nurtured would seep into every corner of Maplewood Lane. Her first kill of the night was swift and efficient. Mrs. Abernathy, the self-righteous gossip who had spent years meddling in everyone else's lives, was the perfect choice to start the chain reaction. Veronica had prepared meticulously, planting the seeds of her plan over several days. She knew Mrs. Abernathy's routine well, her evening ritual of sitting on the porch with a glass of red wine, her self-satisfied smirk illuminated by the glow of her phone screen. Veronica had slipped into her yard earlier that afternoon, carrying a syringe filled with a potent, odorless poison she had learned to synthesize. The wine bottle was in its usual spot on the porch table, waiting for its owner. Veronica worked quickly, injecting the poison through the cork with the precision of a surgeon, leaving no trace of tampering. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she watched from her window, her heart a steady drumbeat in her chest. At precisely 8:15, Mrs. Abernathy lifted the glass to her lips. By 8:30, her body slumped forward, the wine glass shattering against the porch floor. Veronica allowed herself a single moment of satisfaction before moving on. Her next target required more creativity. The Rowlands, the elderly couple who lived 2 houses down, had been a fixture of the neighborhood for decades. Their golden retriever, Daisy, was a constant presence. her wagging tail and friendly demeanor a sharp contrast to the suspicion that now hung over the cul-de-sacs. But Veronica had noticed something others hadn't: Daisy's recent limp, the way she struggled to keep up on their evening walks, the vet visits, the whispered conversations about her declining health. It was all fuel for Veronica's plan. That night, as the Rowlands prepared for bed, Veronica crept into their backyard, a gas canister in hand. She knew they used an old propane heater on their enclosed patio, a habit they had maintained even as the weather grew warmer. The propane tank was her target. With careful precision, she loosened the valve just enough to cause a slow, silent leak, the flammable gas filling the enclosed space like an invisible tide. There was a stick in the till precisely located where the vacuum would draw. As she retreated into the shadows, she saw Mr. Rowland step outside to turn off the patio light, his hand reaching instinctively for the heater. The explosion was instant, the fireball lighting up the night like a macabre fireworks display. The neighbors rushed outside, their faces pale in the orange glow. Veronica stood among them, her expression carefully crafted into one of horror. How could they? The chaos of the explosion provided the perfect distraction for her third kill. The Talbots, the young couple with 2 children, had fled their home in terror, standing among the crowd that gathered to watch the firefighters battle the inferno. Veronica slipped away unnoticed, her movements silent and deliberate. She had prepared for this moment, knowing that panic would drive people into thoughtless routines, their focus on the disaster rather than their surroundings. The Talbots had left their back door unlocked, a mistake Veronica had anticipated. She entered their home quickly, the faint scent of smoke wafting through the open windows. In the children's room, she found what she needed: a collection of plush toys scattered across the floor. She had brought a syringe with her, the needle filled with a fast-acting, undetectable toxin she had learned about during her late-night research. Injecting the poison into 2 of the stuffed animals, she carefully placed them back on the beds, where the children would undoubtedly find them later. It was cruel, perhaps the cruelest of all her acts, but Veronica felt no hesitation. In her mind, they were collateral damage, a message to their parents that no one on Maplewood Lane was untouchable. By the time the Talbots returned to their home, Veronica was already moving on to her next target. Mr. Harrison, a retired Army veteran who lived alone at the far end of the street, was a man of routine. Every night, at exactly 10 p.m., he stepped out onto his porch to smoke a cigar, a habit that had earned him more than a few passive-aggressive complaints from his neighbors. Veronica had watched him from the shadows for weeks, noting the way he leaned against the railing, his eyes scanning the empty street. Tonight, she approached his house with a small crossbow she had purchased online, the weapon modified to fire syringes rather than bolts. She had tested it in her backyard, ensuring its accuracy. As Mr. Harrison puffed on his cigar, she took aim from the cover of a nearby tree, and the syringe struck him in the neck, the toxin working quickly to paralyze him. He slumped against the porch railing, his body going limp. Veronica retrieved the syringe before slipping away, her footsteps muffled by the soft grass. As the night wore on, the once quiet neighborhood descended into chaos. Sirens wailed as emergency vehicles swarmed Maplewood Lane, the flashing lights painting the houses in shades of red and blue. The neighbors huddled together in small groups, their faces pale, their voices trembling with fear and confusion. Rumors spread like wildfire, each death adding another layer of terror. Veronica moved among them like a ghost, her expression a perfect mask of concern. She offered comforting words, nodding solemnly as the neighbors speculated about what could possibly be happening. Inside, she was exhilarated. This was the symphony she had orchestrated. Each death, a note in the melody of destruction. The final kill of the night was the most personal. Dr. Weaver, the neighborhood's self-proclaimed moral authority, had been a constant thorn in her mother's side. It was Weaver who had started the rumors about Eloise Hayes, who had whispered about mental instability and unfit parenting behind closed doors. Veronica had waited years for this moment, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. Dr. Weaver's house was immaculate, every detail carefully curated to project an image of perfection. Veronica knew her schedule well, the late nights spent in her home office, the glow of the computer screen visible through the window. She entered through the basement, bypassing the alarm system she had learned to disable. The scalpel felt heavy in her hand, its blade sharp enough to slice through flesh with ease. Dr. Weaver never saw her coming. The kill was intimate, messy, the silence of the house broken only by the wet sounds of the blade and the faint hum of the computer monitor. As dawn broke over Maplewood Lane, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. The once perfect cul-de-sac was now a crime scene, its pristine facade shattered. Veronica returned to her home, her hands trembling not with fear, but with adrenaline. She washed the blood from her hands, her reflection in the bathroom mirror unrecognizable. She had become something else, something darker, and she wasn't finished. The symphony was far from over. The air on Maplewood Lane was thick with tension, a suffocating miasma of fear that seemed to settle over the cul-de-sac like a storm cloud. The deaths, once brushed off as tragic coincidences or freak accidents, had now escalated to a point where denial was no longer an option. The neighbors were dying, too frequently, too violently, for it to be random. Maplewood Lane had become a breeding ground for paranoia. Each resident retreating further into their homes, their curtains drawn tight, their lights kept on late into the night. The sense of community that once defined the cul-de-sac was now shattered, replaced by suspicion and whispered accusations. No one trusted anyone anymore. And that was exactly how Veronica Hayes wanted it. But even the most carefully orchestrated plans have cracks, and Veronica's was no exception. For weeks, she had executed her vengeance with surgical precision, leaving no evidence, no trace that could tie her to the chaos she had unleashed. Yet, in her growing confidence, she failed to see the faint, almost invisible threads that were beginning to unwrap. Her perfect web of deception, so meticulously constructed, was starting to fray, and Detective Eleanor Price was the one tugging at the loose threads. Detective Price was not the type to be intimidated by fear or misdirection. A seasoned investigator in her late 40s, she had seen her fair share of horrors, and Maplewood Lane's streak of deaths had piqued her curiosity in ways no case had in years. She was meticulous and methodical, with a sharp mind that thrived on unraveling the most convoluted puzzles. The other investigators assigned to the case dismissed the deaths as isolated incidents, the kind of tragedies that occasionally struck even the safest neighborhoods. But Price saw something they didn't. The patterns were there, buried beneath layers of coincidence and misdirection, and the more she dug, the clearer they became. Her breakthrough came on a humid summer morning, when forensic teams combing through the remnants of the Talbot fire found something that didn't belong. It was a scrap of fabric, charred at the edges but still identifiable, a piece of black cotton, likely torn from someone's clothing. It was a small detail, one that could have easily been overlooked, but to Price, it was a gold mine. The Talbot fire had been ruled an accident, a result of faulty wiring in the backyard shed. Yet the presence of the fabric suggested otherwise. Someone had been there, and they hadn't been careful enough to cover their tracks. Price took the evidence to the lab, where it yielded even more questions. Embedded in the fabric were faint traces of gasoline, a clear indicator of arson. The news sent shockwaves through the precinct, forcing the other investigators to reconsider their conclusions. What if the fire hadn't been an accident? What if none of the deaths had been accidents? Price began to dig deeper, combing through reports, revisiting the crime scenes, and interviewing the remaining residents of Maplewood Lane. She spoke to them one by one, her questions probing, yet disarmingly calm. She wasn't just looking for answers, she was studying them, observing their body language, their tone, their reactions. When Price knocked on Veronica Hayes' door, she felt a flicker of unease for the first time. Veronica answered with her usual facade of politeness, her expression blank, her voice soft and measured. She offered nothing incriminating, her answers carefully rehearsed, her demeanor devoid of any telltale signs of guilt. But Price had been in the game long enough to sense when something was off. Veronica's calmness felt too calculated, too perfect, like a mask that fit a little too tightly. Price couldn't explain it, but something about her lingered in the back of her mind, like a splinter she couldn't quite dislodge. The turning point came when Price requested access to the residents' phone records, a a request that was reluctantly granted after weeks of red tape. Among the data, a pattern emerged. In the days leading up to each death, a series of internet searches had been made from a device registered to Veronica's address. The searches were specific and chilling: how to tamper with electrical wiring, how to make homemade poisons, how to create an undetectable fire accelerant. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Price's instincts had been right. Veronica wasn't just another resident of Maplewood Lane. She was the spider at the center of the web. What Price didn't know was that Veronica had already begun to suspect she was being watched. The unease that had gnawed at her since Price's first visit had grown into something sharper, more urgent. She noticed the unmarked car parked at the end of the street, the subtle shifts in the neighbor's behavior, the way Price's questions lingered in her mind long after their conversation had ended. Veronica had always been careful, but now she felt the walls closing in, the tightrope she had been walking beginning to fray beneath her feet. Desperation made her reckless. She decided to act, to eliminate the one threat that could unravel everything she had built. Price was methodical, but Veronica was ruthless, and she believed that ruthlessness would give her the upper hand. She began to follow the detective, studying her habits, her routines, just as she had done with her neighbors. Price lived alone in a modest apartment on the edge of town. Her schedule predictable, her movements precise. It would be easy, Veronica thought. One final kill to secure her safety, to tie off the loose end that threatened to bring her world crashing down. But Price was no ordinary target. She was a hunter in her own right, and she had been hunting Veronica long before Veronica had begun stalking her. The detective had anticipated this move, had seen the desperation in Veronica's eyes during their last conversation. She had set the trap carefully, and when Veronica made her move, Price was waiting. The confrontation was swift and brutal, a clash of wills in the dim light of Price's apartment. Veronica fought with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose, but Price's experience and preparedness gave her the edge. By the time it was over, Veronica was on the floor, her wrists bound, her face twisted in rage and defeat. The arrest sent shockwaves through Maplewood Lane. The residents, once paralyzed by fear, now grappled with the horrifying realization that the quiet, unassuming woman at the end of the street had been responsible for all the bloodshed. Veronica's trial became a media circus, her crimes dissected in gruesome detail on every news channel. She showed no remorse, her face a mask of defiance as she listened to the charges against. When asked why she had done it, she offered no explanation, no justification, only a chilling smile that haunted the courtroom. Detective Price watched from the back of the room as the verdict was read, guilty on all counts. She felt a sense of closure, but also a lingering unease. Veronica had been stopped, but the darkness she had unleashed on Maplewood Lane could never truly be erased. The neighbors would never trust each other again, their lives forever shadowed by the horror that had unfolded in their once idyllic cul-de-sac. And as Price left the courthouse, the memory of Veronica's smile followed her, a reminder that evil often hides in the most unassuming places. The night was unusually quiet, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to unfold. A pale moon hung low in the sky, its dim light casting long shadows across the empty streets of Maplewood Lane. The neighborhood, once the picture of suburban tranquility, had become a husk of its former self. A desolate, paranoid landscape, but the real terror had always been right there, living among them, wearing the face of Veronica Hayes. And tonight, Veronica would face the end of the web she had so meticulously spun. Veronica's plan to eliminate Detective Eleanor Price had been hastily concocted, driven by a combination of desperation and mounting paranoia. She had watched Price from the shadows for weeks, tracing her routines and looking for weaknesses to exploit. The detective was meticulous and guarded, her movements precise, her habits predictable. Yet Veronica believed in her ability to outthink and outmaneuver anyone. After all, she had killed 13 people and walked unnoticed among the carnage. To her, Price was just another obstacle to overcome, a loose thread to tie off, before it could unravel her world. The confrontation was set for Price's apartment, a modest third-floor unit at the edge of town. Veronica had broken in earlier that evening, using the lock-picking skills she'd honed during her planning phase. She moved through the small space like a shadow, leaving no trace of her presence. Her weapon of choice for this final kill was a syringe, loaded with a lethal dose of potassium chloride, a substance that would induce a quick and silent cardiac arrest. It was clean, efficient, and untraceable, a fitting end for the woman who had come too close to uncovering the truth. Veronica positioned herself in the corner of the darkened living room, her body coiled like a spring, her senses heightened. She wore black gloves, her hair tucked beneath a dark hoodie. Every breath she took was shallow, every muscle in her body taut with anticipation. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times, visualizing every possible outcome, every move Price might make, and yet, despite her meticulous preparation, there was a gnawing unease in her chest, a faint whisper of doubt that she couldn't quite silence. When the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside, Veronica's heart began to race. She tightened her grip on the syringe, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. The lock clicked, the door creaked open, and a silhouette appeared in the doorway. Price entered the apartment, her movements brisk but calm. She hung her coat on the rack by the door and set her keys on the counter, oblivious to the predator lurking in the shadows. But then something changed. Price paused, her head tilting slightly, her body stiffening. Veronica's breath hitched. The detective's hand hovered near the light switch, but she didn't turn it on. Instead, she moved slowly, deliberately, her eyes scanning the room. She wasn't surprised. She was prepared. That's when Veronica realized she had made a critical miscalculation. Price had been expecting her. The trap was sprung before Veronica could react. In one fluid motion, Price reached into her coat pocket and withdrew her firearm, aiming it at the darkness where Veronica stood. A beam of light from a tactical flashlight pierced the shadows, landing squarely on Veronica's face. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Price's sharp and calculating, Veronica's wide and feral. Her stillness shattered as Veronica lunged forward, the syringe glinting in the dim light, but Price sidestepped the attack with practiced precision. The living room erupted into chaos. Furniture toppled as the two women struggled, their bodies colliding in a brutal, desperate dance. Veronica moved with the frenzied energy of someone who had nothing left to lose, her every strike fueled by panic and rage. But Price was composed, her movements efficient and controlled, each one designed to neutralize rather than harm. The syringe scrambled to retrieve it, but Price grabbed her wrist and twisted her arm behind her back, forcing her to the ground. Veronica thrashed against the restraint, snarling like a cornered animal. Her mind raced, searching for an escape, a way to turn the tables. But Price's grip was unyielding, her strength far greater than Veronica had anticipated. As the detective pinned her to the floor, Veronica's carefully constructed world began to collapse around her. The illusion of control she had clung to for so long was shattered, replaced by the cold, crushing reality of defeat. By the time the reinforcements arrived, summoned by Price's silent alarm, Veronica was lying motionless on the floor, her chest heaving, her face a mask of exhaustion and despair. The officers who entered the apartment were greeted by the sight of the infamous killer subdued, her reign of terror finally brought to an end. They handcuffed her, their expressions a mix of relief and unease, as though they were in the presence of something monstrous. In the days that followed, the story of Veronica Hayes became a media sensation. The quiet woman who had lived at the end of Maplewood Lane was revealed to be one of the most prolific killers in recent history, her crimes dissected and sensationalized by every news outlet. The residents of the cul-de-sac were thrust into the spotlight, their lives forever altered by the revelation. But beneath their words was a deeper unspoken guilt, the realization that they had failed to see the darkness growing in their midst. Veronica herself remained cold and unrepentant during the trial. She listened to the testimony of her surviving neighbors with an expression of detached indifference, her eyes devoid of remorse. When asked why she had committed the murders, she offered no explanation, no justification. Her silence was more chilling than any confession could have been. Detective Price, hailed as a hero for bringing Veronica to justice, struggled to find closure. She knew she had done her job, that she had stopped a monster, but the weight of what she had witnessed lingered. The darkness that had consumed Maplewood Lane had left its mark on her, a shadow that followed her even in her moments of triumph. As for Maplewood Lane, the neighborhood would never recover. The perfect facade it had once presented to the world was gone, replaced by a legacy of fear and mistrust. The houses, once symbols of safety and prosperity, now stood as silent witnesses to the horrors that had unfolded. And while Veronica Hayes would spend the rest of her life behind bars, her presence on Maplewood Lane would never truly disappear. Her memory lingered in the cracks of the pavement, in the whispers of the wind, in the shadows that stretched long and dark beneath the pale moonlight.